Hi, welcome to this video where we'll be doing a brief general overview of technical communication. So I like to start with this quote. It's from Gopin and Swan in their article, The Science of Scientific Writing. Now, with the caveat that that article is a bit old and scientific writing isn't exactly the same as engineering writing, I think this nicely captures a core theme of technical communication in general, which is that we want it to be as accessible and clear as possible without minimizing the complexity of our content. This arises as it's applicable to any time you're writing about complex content, but technical subject matter does uh, tend to raise that challenge quite a lot, and that's the goal. So there are various qualities and characteristics that we want to have in most nonfiction writing, some of which are shown there at the bottom of the slide. And then in the oval there, we have certain characteristics of communication in professional or workplace contexts. And when the subject matter is of a technical nature, there are particular distinct considerations that arise as well. So let's talk about a couple key things here. So first there you see audience centered. Now, audience and purpose are often referred to as the twin key considerations in technical communication. So we address audience there explicitly. The purpose piece is captured by the reference to being problem solution or goal driven, because in technical and engineering contexts in particular, we're generally in a situation where our overarching purpose is some sort of problem solving scenario. And then in support of that, we find that most of what we're trying to do in most of our communicative deliverables is some combination of informing and persuading. Now, the ratio of inform to persuade is going to vary a lot by the particular situation, and we'll talk more about that as in subsequent lessons. And the way that we approach in informing and persuading also can vary by the context, and we'll get into that in future lessons as well. But informing and persuading tend to be the driving themes of the purpose piece, which centers around problem solving. Let me go to this next slide, which elaborates a bit on those 5 items in the oval there that we saw on the previous slide. So first thing I want to point out here is how being audience-centered and multi-channeled really go hand in hand, because the fact that we might have multiple very varied audiences. They may vary by background, they may vary by authority or decision-making power in our context. They may vary by education, experience, available time, interest level, motivation, how closely we work with them. There's so many factors by which our audience can vary, and we need to try to foresee and anticipate as much of that diversity in our audience as possible. And then having our deliverables be multi-channeled simply means that we're taking that into account in how we design the document or the presentation or whatever the deliverable may be. So, as a simple classic example of this, we'll take the the document format of a memorandum, and that's a document format that we'll also talk about in a subsequent lesson. But the typical structure of a memorandum has a header, an overview, and a discussion portion, which is the main body, and then sometimes that has multiple sections or even subsections depending on the length. So in that case, the overview piece is targeted towards a subset of our audience that we don't expect to necessarily read the rest of it. So we have to make careful and intentional choices about how to craft that overview portion so that the most critical information for those portions of our audience still gets across. Now, as we'll elaborate more on going forward, one a couple of tools in our toolbox for shortening and summarizing something, boiling it down to its essence, or whatever, however you want to put it, include prioritizing and abstracting. So prioritizing is just leaving stuff out. Something you just decide it doesn't make the cut. It's just not important enough to make it into the summary or the overview, or whatever the condensed version is in a given case. So in a memorandum, we typically, the general term is overview, and then sometimes the overview has multiple components, which we'll get into. But for our purposes here, I'll just refer to it as the overview portion. So when summarizing something for the overview portion of a memo, for example, you will look at a lot of the information in your discussion portion and say, this just doesn't have to be there. So that's prioritization. The other is abstracting. That's where you say, I have to reflect this information somehow, but maybe there's a way to rephrase it. So, instead of having 2, 3, 4, 5 statements or facts, you might think of one statement that fairly captures those multiple statements, albeit at the expense of some level of detail, maybe being a bit more vague, knowing that that additional detail remains available in the discussion section if and when desired. But certain members of your audience may value the efficiency of just getting it on a more general level. So abstraction and prioritization, typical tools of meeting that multi-channel design. And that's just one example of how we might do that. When we talk about other document structures, we'll get into other ways that multi-channel design helps serve the needs of different audiences reading for different reasons and perhaps at different times. That also ties in to this critical quality of being easy to read. Now, this is something that we, of course, want to be true of most writing, but it can be a unique challenge with complex topics, notably technical subject matter. So, for example, there are things that people will talk about doing, like try to avoid jargon, right? You might hear somebody say, "Oh, minimize jargon." Okay, well, yeah, that's a good thing to keep in mind. We want to minimize the use of jargon, but remember that quote I started with from Gopin and Swan. We also have to keep in mind that we want to not lose the complexity or the detail to the extent that it's needed for the people that it's needed. So we may need to keep a certain amount of highly technical terminology to go back to my memo example, in the discussion portion. We might minimize its use in the overview portion, but we still, even there, have to be careful and methodical about it. There may be certain technical terms that do need to be used, but we shouldn't just use it willy-nilly. We should think Okay, do I have to teach my audience about this term? Do I have to introduce it? Will some of my audience be unfamiliar with it, but I'm making the judgment call that it needs to be used for some reason? So there are judgment calls that have to be made in deciding how to combine the goals of being easy to read, being accessible, and also making sure that everybody has the information that they need uh, as part of that multi-channel design that I mentioned. I also just want to touch on the ethical piece here. Like most professions, engineers, uh, those who write technical things, do have an obligation to consider the ethical implications of our work. This can be simple general things like avoiding deception and clearly dishonest statements. It can also include be using your communication skills to advocate for ethical decisions, as well as, of course, considering the minimization of any legal liability. Um, we will talk a little bit more about ethics and the intersection between ethics and communication going forward in the course. So, one thing that I often like to point out is that as engineers, we can consider the parallels between designing a communicative deliverable, such as a document, and designing a product. And some of the human factors considerations are analogous. Um, there, as there are often a lot of judgment calls we make that for which there could be a range of reasonable decisions, and sometimes something is clearly outside that range. Something is just clearly a bad decision that doesn't make sense. Other times it's more debatable. But even in those cases, sometimes we have conventions that we follow because of the value of standardization for its own sake in some cases. So in a document situation, these can include things like font, size, type, approaches to emphasis. For example, underlining is generally frowned upon in more and more cases. I still use it occasionally, but I'm trying to quit because it's kind of a holdover from typewriter days that has stubbornly held on. And so, as a convention, it's becoming less and less favored, and it does have arguably some objective disadvantages as well. Line spacing, justification. Typically, we want, in most cases, what's called ragged right or left justified. Full justification is common in certain situations like books or newspaper articles, but generally our default is left justification. Citation, there's a lot of different formats for that depending on the situation. I will say that for purposes of our class, I've posted a simple one-page guide for formatting or style and another for citation. And they're both fairly minimalist just to get you used to following a standard convention, because there will be situations in your professional life where you're working for an organization or submitting to an organization, and they have certain conventions that may seem a bit arbitrary, but again, there is value in standardization, even if you're within an objectively reasonable range of choices. Uh, on the right side of the slide there's just some general points about uh, other human factors considerations. Again, there are not really hard and fast rules about things like how to organize your paragraphs and how to organize your subsections. There are general principles. There are certain heuristical guides that can that can be helpful to ponder and think about, but they're not going to spit out the answer for you. It's not formulaic, much like the judgment that we have to cultivate in making good design decisions in many situations, right? So it's good to be mindful of these considerations, the limits of short-term memory, how to aid reading speed and comprehension. Think about your use of white space. Think about how to organize your headings and subheadings. Think about good practices for paragraph design. Uh, the thing to keep in mind is we're always improving in the judgments that we make. It's not like anyone gets it perfect. It's not like you're ever going to have a final product where nobody can disagree about any judgment call that you made, right? And so the key is number one, stay within the reasonable range. Number two, follow any conventions. And number three, make your best judgment. And every time you make a new deliverable, try to do a little better. That's all we can do, right? This is a career-long improvement process. Uh, so, as a couple examples, sometimes in slide design, you may hear about the 7x7 rule. That's a useful, I shouldn't even use the word rule, but it's a useful guideline to kind of keep in mind that in general, it's good for a presentation slide. By the way, this is for presentations, not lectures, very different genres, so you don't have to tell me how much I violate that rule. But in a presentation, it's often said you want to try to limit yourself to 7 lines and 7 words per line. No more than that. Does that mean you can't bend it or occasionally break it hard? No, it just means you want to kind of keep it kicking around in the back of your mind so that you're mindful of why am I breaking it? Do I have a good reason? How often am I doing it? Similarly, you might hear or read that typical paragraph target lengths are sometimes said to be between 100 and 200 words. Again, I've had one sentence paragraphs, and I've had paragraphs go, well beyond that. But again, you just kind of always want to be mindful. Do you have a good reason? Are you breaking it a lot? Why? So these are just kind of things to keep in the back of your mind more than rigid rules to feel like they're constraining you. All right. I want to end by talking about some general tips as we go forward in this class and as we talk about some different specific formats and genres and other aspects of good technical communication. Just keep in mind that you're going to have to be prepared to spend some time learning the different formats of deliverables. So I talked about the memorandum format. We're going to talk about that early on, but there's going to be other formats that we talk about as well, such as formal report. The differences of whether you have a cover page and a table of contents. It may seem not a whole lot of fun to have to spend a lot of time thinking about, but there is really a lot of value and long-term efficacy to your communicative deliverables by spending the time to learn these differences and why we have them and how they can be leveraged to make your communicative deliverables as effective as possible to best showcase the good underlying content about your engineering work, right? Because whether you're designing software or a medical device or whatever the case may be, that work will not get fully appreciated, be fully effectuated, get the whether you're seeking permission to do the project or seeking to convince somebody to adopt what you've done, whatever it is you're communicating for, whether you're trying to explain how it works to somebody, it's not going to be effective if the communication about it or for it isn't effective. And so, as I often say, people don't major in engineering to do technical writing. It certainly wasn't the reason why I became an engineer, but I quickly became very aware of how critically integral it is to being successful as engineers. And so just being willing to spend the time learning the general principles as well as the specific principles of different formats of documents will really pay dividends. Relatedly, we want to remember to distinguish between document formats like a memorandum versus a formal report, as I just mentioned, versus different genres. Different rhetorical genres are that refers to like the difference between a proposal versus a progress report, right? It gets more into the substance of the content. Whereas memorandum versus formal report refers more to the format. So these are somewhat independent of each other. I mean, some genres are more likely to take certain formats, but you could have a proposal be in the form of a memorandum. You could have a proposal be in a different format. You could have a progress report be in the form of an oral presentation, or it could be in the form of a memorandum. A formal report is more likely to be used for certain genres that are capping off a project, for example. But so while there may be some correlations between formats and genres, there's some independence as well. So don't necessarily conflate them. I also just want to point out as a general tip, learn to leverage the features of Word or Word, whatever word processor I use, MS Word, that go beyond just the minimum that you need to crank out a document. Because if you're going to be spending a lot of time in front of your computer writing documents or slides or spreadsheets or making tables, whatever the case may be, you want to be aware that most users, even most frequent users, use only a small percentage of their capabilities. And so just spending a little bit of time once in a while to learn a new feature about it can really increase your long-term efficiency as a preparer of communicative deliverables. So, for example, I recently have started trying to make myself switch from using just relying on bold or a larger font for headings and subheadings to using the heading feature in Word, first level heading, second level heading, third level heading, and so forth. Not only does that create a nice convenient outline on the side, but it also, I recently learned, increases accessibility for people with visual impairments that require use of a screen reader to help them navigate the document. So there can be multiple benefits to using more of these features that are available for us. Reading and rereading and taking a break and coming back and rereading, you'll be surprised how big of a difference that makes. I can't tell you how many times I've read something over and over and over, thought it was fine. Next day came back to, wow, how did I miss this? It makes a big difference. If possible, have another person read it. It not only gives a fresh pair of eyes, but it also helps introduce some audience sensitivity because you get a different person with a different background, different tacit assumptions, and so that can be very helpful as well, even if, or sometimes especially if, they don't have the same specialization as you. Also, there are some writing guides that are good references to consider, not necessarily TC specific, but just general principles of trying to work on that process of continuous improvement of becoming better writers and communicators. So it's just there's different ones out there that you can check out and consider using as a reference. Different people have different preferences for their go-to. So I'll just kind of plant that seed as something for you to consider. Sometimes when you're getting started, you just kind of Google your questions about different situations, and then you may find after a while that, I keep tending to like this one resource that I'm finding when I Google it, and so then you might just change your habit to make that a more direct go-to resource. All right. I think I'm gonna end this here for now as a brief general whirlwind overview of TechCom, and save other things for future lessons. So I look forward to seeing you then. Take care.